Awesome. Well, welcome. My name is Tong Zhang. I'm the executive director of Oregon MESA, and this is an Invention Education Q&A period. It's also, I'm going to be providing an overview of the Invention Education kind of field, and then talking a little bit more about sort of um, the challenges of implementing invention education, especially in regards to keeping a mind towards equity and ensuring that we are, yeah, always keeping that as our North Star. So before I get started, since this is not a big group, I was wondering, you don't have to hop onto camera if you don't want to do that, but if anybody who is on the call wants to kind of just put into the chat or in some other way, if you want to just kind of share if you were to rate your familiarity with invention education from like 1, meaning like you have not heard about it until I just uttered those words, to like 5, like, oh, I'm a pro at things. You provide any sort of context that would be really helpful so that, I can make sure that I can be the most useful to everybody today. You can either pop that into chat, or if you feel comfortable unmuting, that's also fine too. So I'm just gonna give everybody a second. You can share, like, again, okay, some newbies.
I'm a newbie.
Great. Kelly, okay. I'm glad that our that the person who facilitated the intro to mention education is familiar with it. Um, Anybody else who has like a little bit more knowledge about it? You don't have to. I'm just curious. It was like all
I've
newbies
done
or
1 year, so I'm like kind of a newbie, but kind of seen it before.
okay, great. So if you attended the Invention Education intro session that Kelly just went over, a brief portion of this will be a repeat, but majority of it will be kind of, it's kind of like, that was the intro, and this is a little bit more kind of like higher context about the field and kind of things to look out for when you're getting into it. I am going to pop into the chat the presentation that I am going to be using. Let me know if you're not able to access that, but I am going to share my screen. Okay, so make sure that. So, like I said, the session is going to be going over Q&A and updates. The original proposal for this session was also I was going to be providing a little bit more information about the Invention Education convening, the conference that happened back in November. I did not go to that because I got very sick like an hour before I was supposed to get on the plane. So that did not happen. However, I have been going into the Invention Education convenings for the last 4 or 5 years. So I have a lot of yeah, understanding about that. So what I just told you about right now is the agenda. I'm going to talk about the network, talk about overview really briefly, because about the Oregon MESA toolkit, more about like the why and how it was created, and then actually do a brief kind of chat about focus on liberatory mindsets, and then making sure to answer any questions that you have about invention education. I did create a Jamboard that folks can, while we're talking, it's a small group, so you can just put it into the chat. I don't think it'll be hard to keep. I don't think it'll be hard to keep track of, but in case you feel like you really want to be anonymous, and you can also put your questions in there. I just wanted to have it give another opportunity to be able to, yeah, have people pop in. There are any questions that they have, and it can be anything from like, okay, it can be from any perspective. It could be like how to do this with students, how to do this with teachers, how to do this for a program, any concerns you have. Yeah, just want to make sure that I can do my best in trying to answer, or at least provide any resources in other key people that you can turn to. So quick overview about invention education. So first of all, you probably have heard this term, but may not have really understanding of what it is, because it's actually And you can be fully forgiven for that because it is a very new field. And the field is actually something that is really led by the grantees and partners of the Lemelson Foundation. So if you've heard of the Lemelson Foundation before, they are or actually if you haven't heard about them before, they are a philanthropic foundation that was started by Jerome and Dorothy Lemelson. Jerome Lemelson was actually a prolific inventor. He had hundreds of patents, maybe thousands, I don't know, hundreds of patents. And then towards the end of his life and with his wife, they created the Lemelson Foundation. Since we're based in Oregon, Mesa, we just happen to be co-localized with the Lemelson Foundation, which is actually based in Portland, Oregon. But a lot of the initiatives that they fund and programs that they fund are across the country and actually across the world. So Invent Ed is actually a network of basically partners like MESA and other partners doing this work that was founded by the Lemelson Foundation, but now is kind of co-led by outside people. But majority of the people who are still now currently involved in it are still grantees of the Lemelson Foundation. So historical network partners, like folks who actually have been kind of starting the field and talking about this for a while. Some of the oldest organizations actually include Lemelson MIT, which is based in MIT. Their program that serves K-12 is Invent Teams. There's also Citizen Schools. This is based in Boston. A lot of these are based in Boston area. Maker Ed, which is based in California. Society for Science in the Public. You may know them in terms of actually the people who lead like the Broadcom competitions, the big national competitions. Project Event is a program, a younger program that's based in California. Beyond the Nine is actually based in Africa. The Henry Ford Foundation, Henry Ford Museum, and then actually the Lemelson Center, which is based in the Smithsonian. So I would say that the kind of oldest programs that the Lemelson network has funded is actually Lemelson MIT and the Lemelson Center at Smithsonian. And you'll see us on here too. So Oregon Mesa has actually been funded by the Lemelson Foundation since probably, it was about a decade when I started, and I've been in the program for 7 years. So I think at least 15 years. And so we've actually kind of co-created the invention education field in partnership with a lot of these folks. And then, MESA USA, our other MESA USA partners have joined us in the last few years. So that is an overview of invention education. So what is kind of cool about this is that we are all, in terms of MESA, really integral parts of this network. So the Invention Education Framework is actually something that you can find here at this URL. This is something that was, again, given, this was created via surveys of the partners of those partners and others that have been involved. And so a lot of it is sort of just like what it's taking into account what we've been doing all along and trying to find the commonalities. So for the first few years of invention education, when we were actually getting involved in it, the first few convenings, there was a lot of conversations around like, so what exactly is this? Is it different than inquiry? Is this different than design? Is this different than just like the scientific method? And so there was a lot of the trying to figure out, okay, so what is invention education? And they, in the last, I forget when this framework actually got published, they were able to kind of distill it into this this framework that tried to pull the commonalities of the different programs implementing what we now know as invention education. And so what you see on the left side here is really kind of the disposition. So it's just like, I would call these a mindset. So there's like focusing on empathy, creativity, resilience, curiosity, calculated risk-taking, passion, tolerance for ambiguity and complexity, and resourcefulness. And then kind of going through this, like, it's not necessarily a cycle, but kind of understanding that all of the invention education projects will go through generally these tenets, which are, really being based on context, and then focusing on real world problems. I think one thing that is really more unique about invention education as founded in this field is really focusing on problems that matter. So there's some really great creativity that comes from when we think about like just generally tech fields. But I think that one of the things invention education discipline tries to focus on is a little bit more about, solving problems that have an impact on the world. I hate saying this, like, but not always like the best, like, I don't know, cat grooming. So nothing wrong with cat grooming, like that is an important issue. It's just trying to figure out, like, what are the things that in society are problems that we can try to really empower our students to be able to take a part in, as Kelly looks at her cat. So just making sure. I don't want to, again, nothing against cats, but then really focusing on problem solving, continuous learning and iteration. And another element about invention education always to keep in mind is around the sustainable innovation that, again, thinking about the societal impact aspect, that we're talking about invention education, not just like, okay, a quick design, quick creation of something, but something that will last, something that actually also it does not drain from the natural world resources that are available. So again, these are the framework that was co-created by a lot of the folks. Because I wanted to share this because I think sometimes when I hear about, people talking about invention education, people think it's so much, it's like, oh, it's a fixed thing that someone from high up above created and we must all follow it to the T. And I really want to make sure that people understand that it is actually something that is co-created by a lot of people. And it really is something that is sharing, again, the commonalities between a lot of programs who have been doing this for a very long time. So one of the things that, this is something that Kelly covered in her earlier session, but just what we've been doing in Oregon MESA is that for Invention Toolkit is something that we developed in like either 2017 or 2016. And it's really using the invention process we've been doing a while and formalizing it and putting it actually against this in Invent. First it was Invent and now it's Inventor acronym. So the goal of our toolkit is really just increasing access to underrepresented students through this use of invention education. And then to utilize it as a framework to actually teach these different disciplines. What's really cool also about it is the Invention Toolkit is something that we created that even though it's currently implemented in the STEM field and engineering field that we do in MESA, you can utilize this process for, other kinds of fields. You can utilize it and we've had actually teachers implement parts of this in their social studies classes in terms of obviously math is a STEM discipline, but in their math classes in sort of disciplines outside of just standard like engineering. And it's like I said, it's developed focused specifically to engage underrepresented students in STEM. Now used by 40 schools across Oregon that we serve by educators across the MESA USA states. And then we've actually also worked with the largest science museum in Oregon, OMSI, Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, to actually train their staff. And so they also have been taking a lot of the invention toolkit into their own practices. If you've seen this, you will realize that there's a lot of similarities and it is based in some part on the human-centered design process, but with some tweaks, namely some of the tweaks towards the end. So like the I through N are pretty much just like very similar to the human-centered design process, but then we added in the telling the world, really sharing those projects with everybody. And then in the last few years, adding the O and the R, which are really elements that I want to talk about today, which are about observing identities, reflecting on their impact in the service of equity. And then, why do we do the human-centered design aspect? I think this was covered previously, but really it's just for our purposes, shifting away from a engineering design process, which is really focusing on building a product, to focusing on solving problems for real people. And the aspect of a real person is so important. We utilize clients because it's as soon as you can get a real person talking to students immediately are starting to build empathy and start to get more creative and start to build interest, because if you're oftentimes, even like in our cases, when we rush things and we give just like a problem statement, something that we take from a real person, students can, it's not as easy to engage them, because we can always say things like that are really cool, like, oh, I think that space is really cool, or I think that like agriculture tech is really cool. But for kids, if they're just hearing about those concepts, they're still just very like general concepts, and they may not have a personal attachment to it. But when you put a real person in front of students, their interest and engagement immediately increases. And so that's why we always it's really important to emphasize that we actually want to have real clients talking to students about their real lives. And then when they start talking to them, the kinds of creativity that comes is far more than just building a specific product. Like, you could see that even in a shift for MESA, when we went from building prosthetic arms, which prosthetic arms serves humanity, like there's a lot of really great empathy aspects to it, but everything kind of looked, like a prosthetic arm, because we told people to build a prosthetic arm. But if you talk about, how do we increase the accessibility of a person who has more limited mobility, the kinds of devices that would have been created would have been far more, because they could, people could have focused maybe on wheelchairs, or somebody could have been focusing on an app that actually helps it. There's so many different more opportunities for creativity when you focus on the person as opposed to the specific product. Then why do we do this in terms of like actually for student progression and building on their confidence and everything, is that Invention really in the long term gives them practice on those entrepreneurial mindsets that really make them competitive in the current environments. Like, if they're going in and being inventive, like I said, you could apply it in a social studies context, you can apply it in the business context. Like, there's a lot of really creative thinking that goes into invention that does not have to just be applied in engineering. And why do we use the human-centered design aspect? Being able to be user-focused will make sure that when students, or not make sure, but will hopefully encourage students when they go into these fields to actually create products that have actually a usable and marketable public. So I will share that my husband is a user experience designer, and oftentimes he's working with engineers where engineers will start creating a product, and then on his end, he'll actually have to make it usable. And oftentimes when we're just focusing on the product, there's not a user base for it. It's not going to make the company money if nobody's going to use it. And that may be very like, very consumerism and everything, but it makes our students, and it really encourages our students to actually be competitive in the modern economy. And then finally, Invention, and this is what I want to talk about with a little bit more about focusing on liberatory mindsets, is it is about liberation. It's about providing agency and choice, and really about when we're talking about clients, that these are not clients that we're designing for, these are clients that we are designing with. So really focusing on the fact that, if we can actually utilize Invention in a community-based approach, that our students are also set up, that hopefully they're not just going to go in with a savior complex and trying to solve problems for people, that they are actually going to be solving problems with people and with community. And I want to talk more about this, because this is actually something that has been something that we've seen over time, that we've also learned a lot more about, because we've seen sort of not the harm necessarily. I don't think that significant harm has been has occurred, but there's definitely times where, in the course of giving students, having them do Invention, that oftentimes it places students in a more privileged perspective than the clients, and then it ends up where we are just perpetuating a lot of these practices that are not equitable. And I think that Invention Education, the field itself, Invention itself is actually not equitable. The types of inventions we generally have in society are not actually generally created for universal design. They're not actually created for the majority of people to use. And so our entree into this field is to help support that we are creating, we are helping to foster inventors who actually are empathetic and are actually creating with clients and actually creating products that have lasting impacts, and not just trying to make a quick buck. I'm going to keep going, but I just want to take a quick pause and see if there's any questions so far. That you folks have questions about. Pretty small group, so you're welcome to unmute and ask or pop anything into the chat. Okay, if not, I am gonna keep going. All right, so we want to use invention as a tool for liberation. We must first abandon our assumptions that we know what is best for our communities. So one of the things that we've really tried to do in Oregon MESA is in the last little while, but especially in the last year, focus on our commitment to equity. That we really want to make sure that we are honoring the roots of how MESA was created in our states and how MESAs were created across the country, and that we are continuing to ensure that we are committed to advancing equity by removing barriers, increasing access, and deconstructing systems of oppression. We want to live out this commitment through recognizing and elevating the contributions of BIPOC communities in STEM, nurturing instead of restricting pathways in STEM, highlighting and educating others on how science and technology has been weaponized against communities of color, and then creating supportive environments that celebrate and center how historically underrepresented folks in STEM, especially those who are Black, Indigenous people, color, and women, have contributed to the field. And these are important in invention because, again, a lot of times invention and entrepreneurship tends to be very much like a hustle culture where it's just like people move fast, people move quick, people don't take a step back to think about how communities are impacted, how we are actually moving forward with design, and whether or not the system is set up, like the design system is set up to actually engender like equitable design to come out. So that's why in our invention toolkit, we've actually really tried to focus on liberatory mindsets, and liberatory mindsets are something that this was taken. So the IDEO, which is from the Stanford School of Design, they've were one of the people who really have popularized human-centered design, and in more recent years also tried to make liberatory design part of what they do as well. So focusing on practicing self-awareness, focusing on human values, recognizing oppression, embracing complexity, seeking liberatory collaboration, building relational trust, bias towards experimentation, and then share, don't sell. These are aspects that we've really tried to honor in what we do. But sometimes you can even see in here, it's like, okay, how some of these things, even though we say that we want to do this, are a little bit uncomfortably somewhat at odds with, what we do in MESA. Because, a lot of times when we're having, let's say, our students, even when they're doing the pitch of their competition, how much are they sharing? How much are they selling? And how do we have them talk about the clients and communities that they have, clients and communities that they are working with, that it isn't just another, that it isn't from a deficit mindset, that it is actually important problems that they are sharing, they are solving with their communities. So I will give some examples of how we've tried to evolve on this over time. And the liberatory mindsets is really in contrast with the white supremacy culture mindset. So it's just, trying to, you can see, like, if you're familiar with the white supremacy culture concepts, that the liberatory mindsets, and they're not directly like one for the other, but a lot of times in like just standard invention entrepreneurship, a lot of times the elements of white supremacy culture comes up, like individualism, like I am the inventor who invented, I invented everything. Especially when you see like with the tech fields, like all of these like brilliant, so quote unquote brilliant unicorns who have created problems that have solve big things for humanity, but then they don't really step back and think like, well, did I actually create problems for humanity? There's things like, perfectionism, the sense of urgency. A lot of this you'll see actually in the current invention and entrepreneurship fields. And so again, with invention education, if we are actually training our students to be able to go into this with empathy and going to this with centering equity, how do we not perpetuate some of these elements of the culture? So some of the things that we've tried to do within Oregon MESA is, I mentioned before, we had actually the INVENT acronym in the more recent years added Inventor or Inventori. This is our Spanish version of our invention toolkit. And really amplifying the fact that we have the like observing identity and reflecting on impacts in the context of equity. And the Spanish version also gets the additional aspect of amplifying voices in the community. So the English one doesn't get Inventora, only the Spanish version gets the A, which is amplifying also the community aspect. So that's one way that we've tried to take that into account and try to move away from so just not just invention, but also going into the observing equity aspects. One other thing that we try to do is in our themes, focus on collaborating with clients and not from a deficit mindset. So in the earlier parts of when we were doing invention, a client theme was, I'm blanking right now because I created it, so it wasn't like I fully was responsible for. One of them was designing for folks who were visually impaired. So that was the client category. So in Oregon, we always use a client theme. And I chose that theme because I happen to be visually impaired. When I'm not wearing glasses, I'm very visually impaired. But that wasn't always, obviously the case for all the students who were designing. And so that was an example of something where it's very like, instead of having a like societal challenge or having a theme that is focused on a community issue, it was focusing on a person that potentially had a deficit or potentially had what the students were seeing as a deficit. And so in the last few years, we've tried to shift away from that and really choosing issues that were able to be more generalizable and also never puts a single person in a deficit standpoint. So in 2020, our theme was La Familia, was actually like their family members because everybody was stuck at home, so we couldn't find them. They weren't going to be able to find clients outside of their home. So that was a way to actually, really kind of ground it in equity and ground it in community where it was like their actual community. It was the people who were living in their house. Yes, last year we focused on from harvest to table. That was actually supposed to be from farm to table, but then we actually got a lot of feedback when we shared this with rural parts of our state, especially those that were suffering from severe droughts in Southern Oregon. That farm was really a term that was going to cause a lot of negative harm. Just centering the word farm was going to potentially harm, was going to potentially also kind of put things in a deficit mindset because of the severe challenges that a lot of the farms were experiencing, and all sort of the difficult relational issues that certain communities were already facing in the region. So change it to harvest to table. But that was focused on anybody working in the food industry. So from people who were farm workers to like restaurant workers to people, doing food distribution. So anybody in that. This year, we're focusing on designing for environmental justice as part of a 3-year theme around the climate. So we have designing for environmental justice this year. Next year will be environmental conservation, and the third year will be environmental prosperity. Again, trying to think about, so oftentimes we see students when you're jumping into the issues about the environment, immediately going to like, oh, I'm going to solve climate change, which great. We would love for our kids to solve climate change, but it's really important in this approach that we're trying to get students grounded to people first, because really easily try to jump towards like, okay, how do we like save the trees, which great. We want to also save the trees, but our purpose with this was to try to get them like, how does the environment actually impact me, impact my local community? I will say, at least for the people in Oregon, we've had pretty much the entire state has been severely affected by wildfires in the last few years. We've had heat domes, we've had weather patterns that were that everybody in the state has experienced. So finding a client wouldn't necessarily just be like people in, obviously those from vulnerable populations are impacted more, but also those who, like I had to evacuate my home because of the wildfires. A lot of people have been impacted by this. So really thinking about, again, rooting these themes in problems that matter for students, but also thinking about the privilege of the students in respect to the clients that they are experiencing, that they will be interviewing. The other thing that we've tried to do is educating our general community. So what we do this is via MESA talks. So these are providing more context. So these are like really candid conversations we have with folks who are experts in the field, whatever the field is or whatever the theme is. So both of these are environmental justice, but we actually last year had around food. We had a really robust conversation around food insecurity. And so there were some really dynamic conversations that happened around different people who work in this field, where they just had, really candid conversation about which populations are overlooked, what are the like pertinent issues that are happening. So this again provides more context to even the adults that are working on this. So that's the teachers, that's the volunteers who are doing this. So thinking about how do we provide more richness to the theme so that it's not, again, something that students read a line for and then think like, oh, I have an idea, I'm just going to solve the water crisis in whatever area, but that they actually go deeper and try to understand things from different perspectives. And then finally, our competitions is something I know that MESA USA is doing a lot of this too. But in Oregon, we've thought a lot about how competitions actually perpetuate inequity, because we see the students who win, and they tend to be in our past students who come from, I will say, two categories. One, either teachers were heavily involved in creating our curriculum, or students who came from schools that had more privilege. So even in the context of Oregon, MESA, not all of our schools are socioeconomically identical. Not all of them are demographically identical. That, taking like every single year, yes, you can say like, well, yeah, it's nothing against the students. Obviously, the students, like the ones who end up doing well, like they're all fantastic. But it's thinking about, well, what was the system that they operated in? How did they get moved on from one stage to the next? Do they all have the same amount of time to work on it? Do they all have the same amount of resources to work on it? And so we've really looked at those elements and tried whatever possible to like provide more resources in different areas. And then in certain aspects, actually tried to completely do away with the competition, and this is at the local level, and switch it to a showcase. So thinking about, okay, so where can students actually opt out of competition as opposed to opt into competition as well? So it's like everybody's automatically eligible, because when we find that like when you say like, oh, you have to qualify, you have to like be able to hit this base level of requirement, it really weeds out and discourages students from participating. And in I would say the last year when we fully leaned into this, I don't know if Kelly, you want to share anything about this before I move on?
No, I think
Any
it was
insights
just,
about the opt-out?
yeah, I think it was just really like during COVID, students who had the chance to still get feedback and opt out of being scored felt way more comfortable than being like, oh, well, the only way I'm going to get feedback is if I get scored. But then they're scared of getting scored. And just taking that ability of being like, all right, do you want to be scored or not when they come into the room with the panel? And if they say yes, then they'll score them, plus give them the feedback. Or if they say no, they'll still give them all the feedback they would have given them and just without a score.
Yeah, and I think that the sort of thank you so much, Kelly, for sharing that. The some of the things that we've heard from other people is like, oh, well, does this mean that you're lowering the bar? It absolutely does not. It just means that we're widening the pool of students who can participate and who feel like they can actually continue on. In the end, may not actually change too much in terms of it doesn't actually make the folks who are the students who are actually the go-getters and who are already doing well actually do anything different. It just brings more students into the pool so that they can actually go through the process. I see, Sarah, you have your hand raised. You want to ask a question?
Yeah, I kind of have a question and a comment because this has
Yeah.
been on my mind since last year, or I guess the beginning of this year when they had the competition. So I was a judge for our local competition, and one of the things that I found really frustrating as a judge was like, we have all of these or the program itself is like really centered around this human-centered design and addressing inequities. And one of the biggest inequities is in STEM, and like who gets the resources, who has the connections, who has the money. And what I saw was that the people who won were traditionally the people who have always won. So it's the people who have had, like who have a Google mentor to help them with coding, who have, all that money or have been doing this long enough that the mentors are really well experienced. And I was really frustrated that there was a team I thought who had a good design. It was a working prototype, but it wasn't like as technically exciting or astounding as the winners, but they had done such an amazing job on the human-centered design aspect. And I find it very frustrating that the rubric encourages this traditional white supremacy, to use the language in this talk, like those traditional criteria to judge something that is supposed to be centered on an engineer's ability to design for equity. And so I kind of have this like frustration that I want to air, but also a request to like, is there a way we can kind of bring this to the national level and say, hey, like maybe we should think about redoing our rubric. Like the primary focus of this should be the engineers, the children's ability to design for equity, not their ability to design at all. I don't know. That was my comment and a little bit of a like soapbox.
Completely understandable, and have a couple of comments for that. So for us, we try to, when it comes to our competitions, we do look at our rubrics, and we try to focus most of like what they're getting scored on things like their presentation skills, how did they interact, like were they able, what kind of conversations they have with their client. We try to like, yes, there's still stuff on there about like the actual device and like all that stuff. We try to aim it especially towards like our regionally based competitions. If they're going to be scored, it's more about where are you at, what is your thought process, what's your next steps, not necessarily the product itself. But that has been a frustration that like a lot of people have had. We know this. And a little bit of a spoiler alert, we are changing things up next year. I don't know if we're going to be announcing things after this in the main session, like what's being announced, because I'm not the one in charge of that. But there is going to be talk about this after this year's nationals, of completely revamping what it looks like. And it is going to be focused more on what are the skills we are wanting students to get out of this. And it's going to be focused on that rather than, the other stuff. Like, so we know,
That's
we
awesome.
understand. We've also been frustrated. We are making changes. And I said spoiler alert because I don't know when it's gonna be announced. But I'm on
And
the
just
committee.
to, it's clear, yeah, with Kelly, we meaning MESA USA, we, not just.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we meaning MESA USA, not us as Oregon.
Yeah, Sarah, I completely agree with what you've shared.
I also have a comment to Miguel. He is saying one of the criticisms from non-MESA competitions at different schools is that MESA competitions aren't as technical. I worry that it becomes too easy. I can see how this is a perception that's very easy to sort of judge MESA for. So I'm in science, and I've kind of had this really strange journey from semiconductors to biology. So like, I've had a lot of practice in like how to kind of creatively think about how I want to apply the things I'm interested in. And me personally, I have always been driven by how can I contribute to society in a way that society wants me to contribute rather than what I think society should do. I find this very important in my work. I find this very important in passing on to other people. And it is very technically challenging to think in that way. It's just not traditionally understood as technically challenging. And I think the way that we can practice this as a society is exactly what MESA has kind of come up with. And the way that we can integrate it into society, this way of thinking about like how do we help other people? How do we kind of understand like what help means? And how do we kind of reformat our idea of what exactly is technically challenging? I think MESA is the right way to do it. And so maybe making Google Glasses looks really flashy, but in terms of utility, it's not always clear, or it wasn't as successful. People are not wearing Google Glasses today, for example, but people still try to do it because it's cool and fun and exciting. But like, there are plenty of technically difficult things that take much longer to develop because of the complexity of the developmental phase. So that's what I see the advantage of MESA and the technical challenge of MESA being. It's just, to me, it doesn't feel very obvious. I think other people don't see it obvious in an obvious way compared to traditional engineering.
Yeah, and also, I mean, Miguel, we definitely hear that as well. And in some aspect, it's exactly what Sarah was talking about in terms of who gets to design what easy means. Or designate what easy means, because one aspect is that if you feel like there are not as many challenging opportunities within your state, you should talk to your state directors to see if there doesn't have to just be one challenge. There could be a lot of different kinds of challenges that students do. So in order to build more on their technical skill, I think I would highly encourage it. That's one of the great things about MESA is that there's a huge wealth of competitions that students could be doing. The other aspect of the invention portion, though, is that a lot of the problem, the greatest, in my opinion, like I'm a huge believer in this aspect, is that it so encourages creativity. And a lot of the problems that students are actually addressing are not ones that they may seem simple in the fact that maybe their solutions are quite straightforward, but they also don't exist because people haven't really, because traditional engineering, a lot of invention is very much from a single, or not a single, but more narrow point of view. And so a lot of the things that I've seen actually our students develop in Oregon over the last, at least 7 years that I've been here, are like really great ideas that I never even thought of. I'm like, oh, that's a simple tweak that nobody's really thought of. And that's the best thing about it, because yeah, those things are actually tweaks that people find useful that they haven't, and it's our job to then just connect them with the next step. So it's like, okay, so then you have this great idea. Let's figure out then, are there high school programs, are there college programs that you can get connected to and then be able to further those ideas. So in Oregon, we have a huge benefit of being connected to another invention program called Invent Oregon that's at the collegiate level. So we've actually had students at our actually now several groups of students that have participated in Oregon MESA in invention. And then they actually take those ideas, or at least some of those elements, and create them in college. And it's actually a college competition that they get funding for. And some of those students actually have gone on and gotten funding for some parts of their projects that they've actually been able to like not any of them are full businesses yet, but at least have taken on to the next stage. And they have gotten that interest from people because they have been unique solutions. They aren't ones that a lot of our students are just coming from backgrounds that aren't normally seen and are not traditionally seen in invention and engineering. And so their ideas are valued. And it's our job in terms of like the state programs and that to actually be able to share with partners and everything that these should be valued. Part of that is the industry does not value them right now. Any other questions at this point? So I know I only have about 10 minutes left of this session. So instead of doing a big, again, this is not a very big group, is what I was wondering is what we could do for the next section is thinking about this screen share again. Thinking about the liberatory mindsets and what we talked about so far. Maybe I'll just give everybody like 4 minutes or so to kind of just a private reflection. Are there other areas you think that would be challenging that you see actually in conflict with invention education or implementing invention? So how do we actually do invention, but actually, use liberatory mindsets and be equitable? Yeah, where do you see our other kind of areas? I just kind of want to have a discussion about that, but give a moment. I was going to do the originally pair share, but we don't have enough time to do that. So be able to give people like 3 to 4 minutes to kind of quietly reflect on this. And then the rest of it we'll be able to either share out about those areas and or answer any other questions that you have about invention. Okay, so I'm going to give everybody 3 minutes to self-reflect. Does that make sense? Any questions about that?
So this is things that seem in conflict with education.
Yeah. So, maybe Kelly is going to, because she looks like, yeah, there it is. Thank you. So the question is in the chat. Yeah, you can just quietly reflect 3 minutes. That wasn't 3 minutes, but I figured that we could maybe start the conversation and see where we go. Does anybody have anything to share?
I have something. One of the things that came up for our high school class last year was the students were concerned that like or they expressed concern that some of the problems feel really big, like how could we possibly contribute to the environmental crisis? We're just high school students, like we don't really have that much available to us as resources, and like kind of that feeling of what can we even accomplish? Like how could we even make a dent in this? So I feel like feeling like the problem is too big, and kind of feeling a little discouraged because of it.
That's a really good one. How did you all try to address that? Do you have it's okay if you don't have anything to share for that, but
I don't have a great way. So the way I tried to explain it was to kind of try and break it into like a smaller contribution. Like
yeah.
not everybody is going to be able to like come up with that, like there is no one solution. And so coming up with a small solution that can make a baby step in the right direction is still like a very valuable thing to contribute. It's a very useful thing in terms of like, I guess, a societal design engineering project, if you kind of think of it as like scientists writing papers or like iterations on phones. It's like, one person came up with an idea and people have been iterating on that, over decades. And I kind of like to see these big problems in the same way of like, oh, you start small and maybe somebody else comes up with something else. So like you don't have to come up with the end solution, is how I tried to explain it, but I don't know if they bought it.
Yeah, that's a really good that's a really good approach. I think that this is the other thing where I would encourage the way that we try to do the what I keep on mentioning clients, and just to provide a little bit more information about that. Clients can be like the school nurse, the clients can be the teacher, clients can be somebody did a great project for their grandmother. The clients don't have to, and like in this environmental justice one that we're doing right now, I offered, like I can be a client because I had experiences of having to like evacuate my house, and I had a little dog, I had my son, they're small, like these, being able to interview. So that's where I think that when Kelly shared in a previous session about like interviewing questions, and how the interview is so important, because anybody can be a client. So just about trying to get to the right, asking the right questions, trying to get to a deeper understanding. And so when I think both Catalin, if that's right, Catalin, all right, okay, Catalin, and Miguel were saying about struggling with the project. That's why I think that when we first started doing Invention Education, we also struggled with it, where like a lot of times students come up with like systems level questions. And if you hear crying, I don't know if you all hear crying in the background, so I apologize if you do. Thank you. Okay, that's my daughter. So the systems level, that isn't as a common challenge that happens when people start going into Invention Education, because they're like, oh, okay, we're going to solve, like I said, the water crisis. We're going to be able to solve some really big problem. And that's why giving them a real person, no matter who that person is, if you frame it around a theme, it really helps them to be able to be like, okay, so this is a person. So if they were just interviewing me, it may be really confusing, because it'd be like, oh, I don't know how to, like, she's just a regular person living her life. But putting it on the context of like, okay, environmental justice, it's like, okay, well, let's talk about how does the environment help impact this person. Or if you're so like last year's theme, Harvest to Table, a person who is working in who is a farm worker, then okay, what is their everyday life like? Do they have to carry a lot of stuff? Like, how does it go from point A to point B? And those end up not with, and it's not a lot of, I will say, our Oregon problems end up being very sexy. I feel like a lot of like our, but I think that they are so interesting because they're very people based. They're one person or like small group of people experience a problem, and the students were able to get to that. And that is where, like, I think that's why we use our approach. Like, we don't use the like big systems idea approach. We try to get like, you have to talk to a real person and try to interview them from a theme perspective. So either their job or like a general societal challenge that they're experiencing. 1 year we use teachers. And so a lot of our students actually created a lot of education, like teaching, but sometimes they were also finding like somebody designed something to for students with on the spectrum, like how to teach students on the spectrum because a teacher was struggling with certain learning tools and everything. And it's giving that theme that really kind of centers people. Otherwise, invention is really hard because then it's like, invent something. That's super hard. I wouldn't be able to do that. So you got to give them, especially middle school, like more direction. And the direction can be a specific theme. And so what we've tried to do as much as possible is that theme has to be something that all of our schools like can access. So if we did something about biking, our folks in Southern Oregon don't do a lot of bike commuting. So that's not going to be a very approachable theme for them.
Yeah, I think what also comes into play when it comes, especially with like middle school, to kind of help them with that struggle is doing this multiple times, doing it in practice. And when I say that, I mean like do it with your students for a mini couple day project or something. Like what we have our students do, especially our middle schoolers, is before they even get into the challenge for the year, they do this process with their classmates for create a lock, like you're having difficulties with your locker system, do stuff with your locker system, create a wallet, create something for them to be able to not have to deal with the weather or something. We give them small topics or just fun things like, you're going to create a spacesuit for each other. What is that spacesuit going to need? And just to kind of have them walk through this process very quickly so that they can kind of get to like a place where when it comes to trying to like come up with ideas, they're not just like stalling. And I think it just comes down to the practice with the silly little activities of, we're going to create spacesuits for each other. So what do you need for your spacesuit? Or you're going to create a wallet for a person, or a book bag or something. Just doing those smaller kind of faster project-based things before you get to the challenge itself for the bigger MESA challenge for your state, I think really helps this, especially the middle schoolers, with kind of like getting that mindset.
Yeah, and one thing I think I can talk with Kelly about, we can, in a previous session, she provided, kind of our pacing guide. I don't know if all of the links are, one of the earlier ones, I'm not sure if all the links still work, but a couple of years ago, especially during virtual times, we have a lot of slides that actually like basically like the slides facilitate the sessions because teachers ask for it. And a lot of them have like sentence starters, a lot of them for like being able to for the teams, so that when they're getting into a room and brainstorming questions and all those kind of things, there's a lot of prompts for the students because we try to do it from the context of younger students and also English language learners so that they could be able to start engaging. So we can, I'll chat with Kelly about which things we can share that not for proprietary reasons, more for like if the links still work reasons. We'll try to get some things over to people. Hopefully that will help. I know I am at time and I did a lot of talking this session, so I'm sorry about that. I did look that there weren't any other questions in the, there was one question about engineering design, which is just, I will just share that it is part of the human-centered design process that we use. But were there any other questions? I'm happy to stick around for a second. I don't know when the next session starts, but I just thank you all so much for attending this. And if you have any other questions, you can pop it into the chat and I'm happy to either follow up with you directly to answer it or try to address it now. Kelly, do you know when the next session starts? I think there's a short